Hello, everyone. My name is Marianne Caputo, and today I am presenting my sociology midterm project called Two Systems of Justice, Racial Disparities in Law Enforcement and Media Response. This presentation analyzes how racial bias operates as a dual force system, showcasing first on our streets through policing practices, and secondly in local newsrooms through asymmetric crime reporting and victim selection. First, to understand this problem, we need to define its two specific institutional pillars. First, on the law enforcement side, systemic over-policing and discretionary pretextual stops routinely bring people of color into legal contact. Second, on the media side, local crime reporting acts as a strong amplifier of racial bias, overrepresenting suspects of color in violent crimes while downplaying their victimhood. Together, these forces lock in racial prejudices within the public. Let's first look at law enforcement. As we see, the pretextual traffic stops are the primary gateway to the justice system. Police officers routinely use minor civil violations, such as a broken license plate light or failure to signal early, as an excuse to pull over drivers and conduct highly discretionary searches. Data from the Public Policy Institute of California reveals that Black Californians are pulled over at rates highly disproportionate to their population baseline. Now, critics of profiling data often argue that racial disparities in traffic stops are just a byproduct of different driving habits, age distributions, or what neighborhoods people live in. Excuse me. To test this objectively, researchers at Stanford University applied a method called the Veil of Darkness test. The logic is simple. Police officers can easily observe a driver's race during the day, but it becomes much harder after sunset. By looking at the exact same hours of the day when seasonal shifts from light to dark, they noticed a clear pattern, which is when darkness masks a driver's skin tone, the proportion of Black drivers pulled over drops by 5 to 10%. This means that when officer visibility decreases, racial disparities decrease with it, providing empirical proof that race itself, not just driving behavior, influences the decision to initiate a stop in the first place. Once a vehicle is pulled over, the disparity doesn't stop. It actually widens during the search phase. Sociological and state-level data reveals a major paradox. Across millions of stops, Black and Hispanic motorists are subjected to discretionary searches at more than double the rate of white motorists. Logically, if a group is being searched twice as much, you might expect police to find more contraband. But the data shows the exact opposite. Searches of white drivers actually yield a higher percentage of illegal drugs, weapons, and contraband. This tells us that the suspicion and biases used by officers is heavily asymmetric. Officers are reacting to a much lower level of imagined suspicion when dealing with people of color, meaning innocent minority drivers are routinely subjected to searches based on implicit bias rather than evidence. Now that we understand how bias operates, let's transition to how it is reinforced in our homes through local news coverage. This slide looks at what sociologists call asymmetric narrative framing, the double standard in how crime stories are packaged and sold to the public. There is a disproportionate use of prison mugshots or booking photos for Black and brown suspects versus family or high school yearbook photos for white suspects. In addition, there are subtle linguistic coding used where minority suspects are framed as systemic threats. So words like thugs, gang affiliated, while white suspects are individualized with words like lone wolf, quiet neighbor. White violence is frequently explained through mental health histories or personal struggles, whereas minority violence is attributed to inherent criminality or their culture. When researchers analyze local media, they find a stark racial split in both imagery and language used. When a suspect is a person of color, news outlets are statistically much more likely to use a harsh police booking mugshot, even if a clean portrait is available. For white suspects, media outlets routinely pull family photos, sports portraits, or graduation pictures. Furthermore, the vocabulary shifts entirely. White suspects are often humanized. Their actions are framed as isolated tragedies caused by underlying mental health struggles. And conversely, suspects of color are rarely granted the same grace. They are stripped of their background and framed purely as systemic threats to community safety. This constant media loop deeply reinforces the implicit bias that officers then bring back to the field. While the last slide showed how the media frames suspects, this slide addresses an equally upsetting bias, which is how the media discusses victims. In sociology and media studies, we use a term famously coined by a late journalist named Gwen Ifill, called missing white woman syndrome. This concept highlights a structural double standard, which is when a white middle-class woman goes missing, local and national newsrooms mobilize almost immediately, dedicating hundreds of broadcast hours to her story. However, data compiled by institutions like the Columbia Journalism Review reveal that when Black, Hispanic, or Indigenous women vanish under identical circumstances, their stories are met with general silence. This isn't just an issue of bad press, and it has severe real-world consequences. Media attention creates public pressure, and public pressure drives law enforcement funding, volunteer searches, and urgency. When the media erases victims of color, they actively starve those cases of the resources needed to bring them home safely. Now that we've examined both law enforcement practices and media responses, we can address the deep impacts that those forces have on our society. This isn't simply about traffic stops or news broadcasts. These two systems work together to create a cycle of institutional erosion and collective trauma. First, when communities of color are routinely overpoliced on the streets and demonized on the news, it destroys any foundational trust in the justice system. When people feel that the law exists to target them rather than to protect them, community cooperation with law enforcement drops, which ironically makes neighborhoods less safe. Second, there's a massive socioeconomic cost. These disproportionate pretextual stops often lead to minor bookings or arrest records. And in our society, a criminal record acts as a permanent barrier. It can block people from stable housing, student loans, and steady employment. By funneling minority citizens into the legal system at higher rates, we are systematically locking generations into a cycle of economic disadvantage. And to solve that problem, we must address those deep-seated structural impacts. As we're drawing to a close, now we can focus on how we can move from diagnosing the problem itself to actively solving it. Because this issue is driven by two distinct systems, law enforcement and the media, our solutions must target both institutions directly. First, on the policing side, cities and states across the country are beginning to restrict or entirely ban pretextual stops. By passing policies that prevent officers from pulling drivers over for minor non-safety issues like a cracked mirror or an expired registration tag, we strip away the legal excuse used to act on bias. Furthermore, shifting basic traffic management to unarmed civilian transit departments reduces the risk of these encounters escalating unnecessarily. Secondly, on the media side, news organizations must break their reliance on police departments for crime stories. Editorial boards need to implement strict ethical guidelines, which means actively tracking the demographic breakdown of their missing person coverage to ensure equity and ending the practice of running suspect mugshots before a conviction. True change requires moving away from individual awareness and focusing on passing these concrete structural policies. To bring everything to a close, I want to leave you with a final thought and a question to kick off the discussion board. Systemic racial disparities in the criminal justice system are not isolated to our streets, nor are they isolated to our newsrooms. They exist in a loop. The police provide the media with dramatic content, and the media packages that content in biased, asymmetric frames, and the public consumes those frames, which reinforces the very biases that officers carry back out onto the streets. To break that loop, we have to demand accountability from both systems. As you prepare your responses, I want to ask you, given how closely local news relies on police departments for crime reports, what editorial standards must news organizations implement to balance immediate public safety notifications with their ethical duty to prevent racial stigmatization? Thank you all for your time. My full APA reference list is uploaded right alongside this video on the discussion board, and I look forward to reading your thoughts and engaging in the comments.